A movie is like a massive ship, and when the ship sinks, directors, either fairly or unfairly, often go down with it. After all, the buck stops with them. In this video, I want to take a look at a few different scenarios where this was the case. In a couple of cases, the directors literally rammed their ship into an iceberg over and over again until it sunk. They've got no one to blame but themselves. In other cases though, the damage was mild but had an outsized impact on the director's career. In one case, the director was literally thrown overboard and someone else stepped in. But in all these cases, one or two flops were enough to change everything for the worse. Jason Friedberg and Aaron Seltzer are responsible for some of the worst reviewed movies ever made, and, some will say, the worst movies ever made. They're also the guys that helped start and then destroyed the parody movie movement of the 2000s. They started as writers on Spy Hard and Scary Movie, the latter of which is hilarious and helped launch a 5-movie series. The first directed feature was 2006's Date Movie, which was mainly a parody of 2000s rom-coms like My Big Fat Greek Wedding, Meet the Fockers, Bridget Jones' Diary, and Hitch, but also included some classics like 1989's When Harry Met Sally, 1990's Pretty Woman, 1993's Sleepless in Seattle, and 1997's My Best Friend's Wedding. The movie made $85 million on a $20 million budget, a resounding commercial success. It also has a 7% score on Rotten Tomatoes, a resounding critical failure. Every movie that they did after this would somehow be worse both critically and commercially, except 2007's Epic Movie, which made close to $87 million, again on a $20 million budget. It's almost impressive in a way. You didn't think that it could get worse, but it could. Epic Movie was, ostensibly, a parody of the epic film genre, even though it didn't really parody any epics except The Lord of the Rings, Star Wars, and, viewed a certain way, Parts of the Caribbean. As much as I enjoy movies like The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, Charlie and the Chocolate Factory, and the Harry Potter movies, they're not epics. The story was the same for Meet the Spartans, a commercial hit and critical flop that's considered one of the worst movies ever made. It was mostly a parody of 300 and one that I spent money on to see in theaters. 2008's Disaster Movie did the same for, obviously, disaster movies. 2010's Vampires Suck parodied the Twilight movies, 2013's The Starving Games parodied the Hunger Games, and 2015's Super Fast parodied the Fast and Furious movies. By The Starving Games, people seem to be over the shtick. It got a 0% on Rotten Tomatoes and failed to make back its tiny $5 million budget. Throughout their careers, the reviews remained consistently bad. Critics felt that the movies failed as parodies, featured excessive pop culture references, and, most problematically for comedy movies, they just weren't that funny. Part of that is because parody is difficult to do well. Mimicking or poking fun isn't parody, nor is referencing plot holes. Parody takes the original material seriously, dissects it, and spins it in an amusing way. It should be measured and thoughtful, which Friedberg and Seltzer's movies just were not. Their movies are considered some of the worst ever made. Joel Rosenblatt, writing for the Austin Chronicle, put it perhaps harshly, quote, "There's no nice way to say this, so I'll just say it. Writer-directors Friedberg and Seltzer are a scourge. They're a plague on our cinematic landscape, a national shame, a danger to our culture, a typhoon-sized natural disaster disguised as a filmmaking team, a Hollywood monster wreaking havoc on the minds of America's youth and setting civilization back thousands of years," end quote. A bit dramatic, perhaps, but consistent with other reviewers. The two haven't made a movie since 2015, but you never know. Kerry Conran is known for just one movie because one movie is all that he's been able to make so far. That's 2004's Sky Captain and the World of Tomorrow, a sci-fi film that was a major step forward for digital filmmaking. It, like Starship Troopers directed by Paul Verhoeven, is one of those movies that didn't get its proper due at the time of its release, but has been hailed not just as a cult classic, but as an important contribution to cinema. With it, Conran saw the future. He was just off by several years. Conran is an impressive individual. He, like Steven Spielberg and George Lucas, was inspired by classic serials, and he set about paying homage to them with a short that would set the stage for his feature. At CalArts, he started working on an idea for a sci-fi movie that would eventually become Sky Captain. It was slow going. He had 6 minutes of footage at the end of 4 years of work. That's 90 seconds per year, or 7.5 seconds of footage per month. He needed money and he needed resources. He got both when the short found its way to John Avnet, a movie producer and director. Avnet loved what he saw. He and Conran worked together on the film, and Avnet got them some money to develop it further. The scope started to grow, but Conran was able to keep a pace with it. They prepared a teaser and got a cast that included Jude Law and Gwyneth Paltrow, both of whom were floored by their creativity, and in production helped push the technical side of movie making forward. While actors working with CGI and digital environments is taken for granted and considered overused now, it was new and novel back then, a true acting challenge. Critics enjoyed the movie, though perhaps it wasn't marketed as well as it should have been. According to Conran, the budget of $70 million that's cited is what the film sold for to Paramount, not what the actual development budget was, which was closer to $12 million. That extra money went to one of the producers, not Conran himself. When the movie made just $58 million at the box office, Paramount was disappointed. That, in the end, ended up hurting Conran, who seems like a decent guy. At the time, he was working on a John Carter of Mars movie, but left the project after a shakeup at Paramount. While he hasn't had a movie since, in a recent Variety interview, he said that he has 2 projects in the works. I hope that he's able to pull them off. The guy is obviously very creative. Kinka Usher is a wildly successful commercial director that, like Kerry Conran, has only directed 1 movie so far. His was 1999's Mystery Men, which, like Sky Captain, got decent enough reviews but was clobbered at the box office. He got his start as a production assistant and worked his way up in the industry, eventually landing at the Corman School of Film. His first job as a director wasn't on a film or TV show though. It was directing a commercial for Acura, and he would go on to make many more award-winning commercials for companies like Nike, Pepsi, and Taco Bell. In 1998, he was honored as the best commercial director by the Directors Guild, and he's won multiple Cannes Lion and Clio awards, the latter of which is basically the Oscars of advertising. It was on the heels of some of his campaigns that he was asked to direct Mystery Men, which was first offered to Danny DeVito for $13 million to star in and direct, though he left over a soundtrack dispute. Usher was hesitant to accept, saying that while the premise was solid, quote, "I thought it was boring," end quote. The movie, which is a superhero comedy loosely based on Bob Burden's Flaming Carrot comics, seemingly had a very chill production, though the shooting went long because the script was being reworked daily. Usher was seemingly easy to work with, and he let his actors do whatever they wanted, saying, quote, "We did a lot of unscripted stuff. I let Ben and Janine go. They were totally free," end quote. He doesn't seem to be kidding, as several cast members have said that they would like to return. Ben Stiller said, quote, "I'm all for it. I had fun doing it," end quote. When it came out, critics dug it, but the audience just wasn't there. It made just $33.5 million on a $68 million budget, though the high budget was probably just a result of the long shooting schedule. It's unlikely that Usher would return, but one can hope. In 2017, during a podcast of Respect the Process with Jordan Brady, he mentioned that he was working on another film. Here's hoping that he gets it done soon. It's hard not to feel bad for Tobe Hooper. The guy directed one of the most important horror movies ever, but wasn't really able to break into the Hollywood mainstream. Hooper, like John Carpenter, Wes Craven, and Dario Argento, is a master of horror. His first film was 1969's Eggshells, after which he made a documentary, but it was 1974's The Texas Chainsaw Massacre that propelled him to the forefront. Made on a budget that was as high as $140,000, the film made an astonishing $31 million at the box office, despite being banned in several countries and some theaters over complaints about the violence. Not only is it now considered one of the best horror movies ever made, but just one of the best films ever made. It also had one hell of a production, with shooting lasting up to 16 hours a day in the hot sun 7 days a week. Unfortunately, it was also the high watermark of Tobe Hooper's career. None of his future films would come anywhere near the success of The Texas Chainsaw Massacre, even though he remained active until his passing in 2017 on both the film and TV side. Hooper hit a snag a few years after Chainsaw on 1982's Poltergeist. The movie was developed by Steven Spielberg, who couldn't direct it because he was working on E.T. at the time. So he chose Hooper, who helped steer it towards a ghost story and away from its sci-fi beginnings, to direct. But according to people involved in the movie, Spielberg basically ghost directed it. He was on set most days and was the director, in all but name, running roughshod over Hooper. Word got around and it would damage both of their reputations. Spielberg's would recover quickly, Hooper's wouldn't. That said, his decline might also have something to do with the fact that most of Hooper's work besides Chainsaw, 1979's Salem Slot miniseries, and Poltergeist didn't do well in terms of critical or commercial acclaim, though some of his work has been reappraised since then. Whether or not he was a victim of his own success is, I suppose, the question. Paul Verhoeven is, above all things, an excellent director and one of the most misunderstood. The guy has no fewer than 5 classics, but a string of flops and negative reviews starting with Showgirls, would not only see the time gap between his movies increase, but also saw him return to Europe for a time. That said, this one has a happy ending. Verhoeven cut his teeth making shorts in his native Netherlands before he started making feature films in the 70s. The first one that got worldwide attention was 1977's Soldier of Orange, made when he was in his late 30s. It also caught the eye of George Lucas, who considered Verhoeven to direct The Empire Strikes Back. But after Verhoeven screened his next film, The Violent Spatters, for producers, he did not get a call back. It also basically forced him out of the Netherlands. Verhoeven would have to wait 7 more years before he finally got his breakthrough hit and would, in a 5-year time span, put out 3 certified classics. The first was 1987's RoboCop. The movie is a masterpiece and one of the defining 80s sci-fi and action movies. Like Spatters, it got some flack for its violence, and Verhoeven was forced to cut several scenes to get it past the censors. Still, it was a success at the box office and kick-started the franchise. Critics couldn't quite figure it out, but over several reassessments over the decades, it's been hailed as groundbreaking, with its violence playing it to its satire. It touched on universal themes of the power of corporations, humanity, life and death, and got some awards recognition. He followed it with 1990's Total Recall, based on Philip K. Dick's 1966 short story, We Can Remember It For You Wholesale. Starring Arnold Schwarzenegger, the movie was one of the year's highest-grossing films. Again, it being a Verhoeven film, it also got some flack for the violence, but its practical effects and excellent score were undeniable. Alongside RoboCop, it's hailed as one of the best sci-fi films ever made, and besides his work on Predator, Terminator, and Terminator 2 Judgment Day, it might also be one of Arnold's best films. The story was the same for 1992's Basic Instinct, an erotic neo-noir starring Michael Douglas with a famous scene from Sharon Stone. The movie was another commercial success like Total Recall and RoboCop before it, spurred some controversy like Total Recall and RoboCop before it, and is a certified classic like Total Recall and RoboCop before it. For a while, it was as though Verhoeven could do no wrong. Sure, his movies divided people, but most agree that they're well made and all 3 were successes. In the 5 years between 1987 and 1992, he conquered Hollywood. Then, in the 5 years between 1995 and 2000, he would be crushed. It started with Showgirls in 1995. The movie was the beginning of the end for several people, actually. It killed the career of leading actress Elizabeth Berkley, who had just made the jump from TV to film. It ended the career of Joe Esterhaus, the highest-paid screenwriter in Hollywood at the time as well. And it got Paul Verhoeven a Razzie for Worst Director, which, to his everlasting credit, he accepted in person, the first to do so. The guy's got a great sense of humor. Showgirls was a critical flop at the time, but was a wild success on home video, raking in more than $100 million in sales. In recent years, it's also been reappraised and has a loyal fan base. Then there was Starship Troopers in 1997. It, like RoboCop, is a satire, though critics didn't seem to get the memo and labeled it as fascistic. Alas, it grossed just $121 million on a budget that was as high as $110 million, all but ensuring that it failed at the box office. State-of-the-art special effects don't come cheap, after all. The movie is now a certified classic and had a recent resurgence in popularity thanks to Helldivers 2. Even before that though, it spawned a franchise, so people obviously came around to it. Then there was 2000's Hollow Man, which made money at the box office, but was crushed by critics. Worse, it crushed Verhoeven, who said, quote, "This is a movie, the first movie that I made that I thought I should not have made," end quote. He later called it boring and would return to Europe to make his next few movies, 2006's Black Rock, 2016's Elle, and 2021's Benedetta. All of them were critical successes, and the first 2 were commercial successes. The guy never really lost his touch, he just lost faith in the American studio system for a while and had to rediscover himself. He recently came back to the US and is reuniting with his RoboCop and Starship Troopers screenwriter Edward Neumeier for his next film, Young Sinner. If it's anything like those 2 movies, I think we're in for a treat. There were enough people curious about me leaving off Josh Trank in a previous video that I think covering him again would be worthwhile. He's a pretty infamous case of a flameout, a modern-day Michael Cimino, if you will, though with less awards recognition. He arrived on the indie scene at 27 with 2012's Chronicle, which starred Dane DeHaan, Alex Russell, and Michael B. Jordan. Superhero mania had just gotten started, and Trank had an interesting, original take that showed how great power can corrupt a person. Chronicle was a critical and commercial success, taking $127 million on a $15 million budget. It made Trank the youngest director to open a film at number 1 in the US box office, beating out Steven Spielberg with Jaws at 28 and James Cameron with The Terminator at 30. Roger Ebert nailed it when he said it, quote, involves elements of a superhero origin story, a science fiction fantasy, and a drama about a disturbed teenager," end quote. 20th Century Fox, Trank's partner, was happy to take a risk on the rising star, giving him the reins and a massive budget for 2015's Fantastic Four. This was, to put it mildly, unwise. Trank went over budget by $30 million, pushing the original $120 million past $150 million. 30 at the time, he was basically Dane DeHaan's character in Chronicle, but less murderous. He had great power and shirked the great responsibility, resulting in a production mess. A Fox spokesperson tried to downplay it, saying, quote, "There were definitely some bumps in the road," end quote. Said bumps were $100,000 in property damage to a rental, antisocial behavior when reviewing footage, possible drug use, and telling actors when to blink and breathe. Fox apparently had misgivings about Trank during pre-production, and it would have been a good idea for them to stop working with him then. But they kept working with him, only to take the movie from him in post-production after they were unhappy with his cut. That did nothing for the movie. It was a critical and commercial disaster. That also upset Trank, who fired off a tweet that read, quote, "A year ago, I had a fantastic version of this, and it would have received great reviews. You'll probably never see it. That's the reality though," end quote. His behavior also led him to lose a Boba Fett movie that he had in the works at Disney. He only made one movie since, 2020's Capone, which was also a commercial and critical flop, though was seriously impacted by the pandemic. The guy's young, so maybe he'll make a comeback with his Theodore Roosevelt film that's in development. I certainly hope so. Chronicle is a great film, and people mature. Before 1997's Batman and Robin, Joel Schumacher had a long, healthy career. He started behind the scenes, working as a costume and production designer, before getting a chance to direct some TV episodes, which he was able to parlay into directing films in the 1980s. His first movie out of the gate, 1981's The Incredible Shrinking Woman, didn't get great reviews, but it did manage to double its budget, so it probably broke even at the very least. The story was the same for 1983's DC Cab and 1985's St. Elmo's Fire. This was the reason that studios liked working with Schumacher. Most of his movies were never a hit with critics except for outliers like 1987's The Lost Boys and 1994's The Client. But all of his movies were, 1, made on the cheap, and 2, pretty much always made money. If they didn't make money, they sure as hell did not lose it. Sure, he had no blockbuster success until 1995's Batman Forever, but one thing we can say is that he wasn't given it on a silver platter. The guy worked his way up to it, and once given the reins after Tim Burton did not return, he knocked it out of the park. The worst thing for Schumacher on this movie was working with Val Kilmer, which seemed to be a recurring factor for everybody that worked with him, especially Richard Stanley, who was screwed over by Kilmer for The Island of Dr. Moreau before being replaced by John Frankenheimer, who also detested working with Kilmer. Basically, Schumacher was in good company in this regard. 1996's A Time to Kill was another strong showing for Schumacher, this time critically and commercially. Again, he proved that he could do a lot with little and turned a $40 million budget into a $152 million hit. Roger Ebert said of it that, quote, "This is the best of the film versions of Grisham novels, I think, and it has been directed with skill by Joel Schumacher," end quote. And then came the big one that ruined it all, or so it seemed. 1997's Batman and Robin starring George Clooney. Made on a budget that was as high as $160 million, the movie was a flop, raking in just $238 million. It was lambasted by critics and had problems from the jump, some of them instigated by Warner Brothers, who wanted Schumacher to do it sooner rather than later and make it much more toy-friendly. That was the wrong move. The flop forced them to cancel all future Batman films that they had in the pipeline and put the bat on filmic ice until Christopher Nolan successfully resuscitated him with Batman Begins. Clooney and Schumacher would both agree that the film did not turn out well. To be fair, Schumacher's career didn't really take a turn for the worst like what happened to Trank, Friedberg, Seltzer, and Hooper. It mostly just got smaller. In his post-Batman career, around half of his movies made money while the other half flopped, though he did have a few big bombs that earned less than $1 million at the box office, which is pretty bad. In a twist of fate, 2000's Tigerland would be his worst performing theatrical film, pulling in less than $150,000, though it got pretty good reviews. Really, his biggest issue was that critics never liked him, though when you look over his entire career, he made much more money than he lost. 2004's The Phantom of the Opera also got some pretty well-deserved Academy Award nominations. Honestly, career-wise, you could do a lot worse than Joel Schumacher. Directing is not for the faint of heart. Your fortunes can change on a dime, though I expect that that's a draw for some. When you paint on a big canvas, you can leave a big mess. If you're Paul Verhoeven, you might be able to clean it up. If you're Jason Friedberg and Aaron Seltzer, maybe not. Whatever the case though, every movie can be a make or break moment. That is, if nothing else, exhilarating.